Chapter 12 of Under Boy Scout Colors by Joseph Bushnell Ames. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 12 A Cry in the Night. Very seldom does reality come up to expectation, but this was one of the rare exceptions. It was the very cabin of their dreams that rose a concrete fact before their admiring gaze. As they stood off surveying the walls of neatly fitting logs, the sloping roof, where a covering of split saplings concealed the useful waterproof tar paper, the square, workmanlike chimney rising beyond, there was a moment of almost awed silence, broken presently by Court Parker. "Some cabin!" he exclaimed, voicing the feeling of them all. "It doesn't seem as if we could have built that ourselves, fellows." "We did, though, we and Mr. Curtis and Mr. Grimstone," jubilated Ted McIlvaine. "Gee, think of its being finished, and think of its being ours! Come on inside." They went with a rush and broke into eager, loud voiced admiration of their handiwork. They tried the bunks, stout frameworks of pine with lengths of heavy canvas stretched tightly over them, and pronounced them better than any mattress, clamorously upheld the merit of one piece of work over another, and discussed the need of a table, chairs, and various other conveniences. Of course a fire was started, and when the red blaze roared up the chimney they rejoiced at the perfection of the draught. Then began a strenuous altercation as to what the cabin should be called, which bade fair to end in a deadlock, owing to the wide variety of suggestions. Neither the scoutmaster nor Mr. Grimstone took part in this. The former believed in letting the boys settle such questions unaided, while the old man so unaffectedly enjoyed the boys' delight that he simply sat in the background, silent but with twinkling eyes. When a lull came in the dispute, however, he bethought himself of something. "There's a pair of elk horns down to the barn you boys may as well have," he remarked. "You can hang 'em up over the fireplace for an ornament." "Elk horns!" exclaimed Dale Tompkins. "They'd be dandy. Say," he went on eagerly, stirred by a sudden inspiration, "what's the matter with that for a name, fellows? Elkhorn Cabin." "Swell!" agreed two or three scouts at once. "That's better than any we've had. Sounds like the real thing, doesn't it?" A vote was promptly taken, and though Ranny Phelps and a few others were against it, the majority approved. The horns, a fine pair of antlers, were fetched and hung in place, and the cabin formally christened. "And next week," said Frank Sanson, as they were packing up for their tramp home through the crisp twilight, "we can come out to camp, can't we, Mr. Curtis?" The scoutmaster nodded. "Provided the weather is decent and you all get your parents' consent, I don't see any reason why we shouldn't spend Friday night here. It may be a bit crowded, but we'll manage some way." As a matter of fact, they did not have to. Indeed, there came very near being no overnight hike at all. During the building of the cabin, the weather had been singularly favorable. It was snapping cold much of the time, but save for a flurry or two of snow, the days had been uniformly clear. Now, however, as if to make up for her smiles, nature proceeded to frown. Wednesday was overcast, and all day Thursday a cold rain came down to damp the spirits of the would-be campers. It turned to snow during the night, and next morning found the countryside covered with a mantle of white. The temperature was well below freezing and dropping steadily, and Mr. Curtis, who had practically given up the idea of occupying the cabin that night, was surprised, toward the middle of the afternoon, by the appearance at his door of a group of white flecked figures, very rosy of cheek and bright of eye, carrying blanket rolls and hung about with cooking utensils and sundry parcels. "We can go, can't we, sir?" inquired Ted McIlvaine eagerly, as he dusted the snow off his coat. "You're not going to give it up, are you?" The scoutmaster's eyebrows lifted. "Have you all got permission?" he asked doubtfully. "Yes, sir, we can go if you go," came in a prompt chorus. For a moment Mr. Curtis hesitated. After all, there couldn't be any risk about the trip, even if the storm continued all night. The cabin was weatherproof, and enough firewood had been cut to last them a week. With plenty of food and good blankets, they would be as snug as possible, and he knew from experience the charm of the woods in a snowstorm. Looking the bunch over appraisingly, he saw that there were only 7. McIlvaine, Parker, Dale Tompkins, Frank Sanson, Bob Gibson, Tuck Gardner, and Pete Oliver, all self-reliant boys of the type who are willing to stand a little roughing it without complaint. "Are you the only ones who want to go?" he asked. "Yes, sir," returned McIlvaine. "Sherman's away, and Wes has a cold. The others all thought—" "Cold feet," stated Oliver, derisively, running his fingers through a thatch of bright red hair. "They're afraid they might get a chill." "Not much danger of that when you're around, Pete," laughed the scoutmaster. "Well, you boys had better come in and wait. It'll take me 10 or 15 minutes to get ready." He appeared in rather less than that time, sweatered, mackinawed, with high-laced boots, woolen cap, and heavy gloves. Over one shoulder swung his blanket roll, and strapped to his back was a good-sized haversack of provisions. He knew from experience that someone was sure to have forgotten something, so he always went prepared to supply deficiencies. It was a joyous, hilarious bunch that made their way through the town and out along the Belden Turnpike. Most of them had their staves, and 2 had brought snowshoes along. Their attempts to use these unfamiliar articles occasioned much amusement among the others. It took the better part of 2 hours to reach the cabin. The snow had drifted considerably, and the road was scarcely broken through. After they reached the woods the going was especially hard, and a general shout of rejoicing went up as the first sight of the sloping, snow-covered roof loomed up through the twilight. When the door was unlocked, they entered with a rush. Packs and blanket rolls were dropped, and a fire started at once. When this was blazing merrily, Mr. Curtis divided the boys into 2 squads, one of which undertook preparations for supper and straightened up the cabin generally, while the others scraped a path through the snow down to the shore of the lake. There were minor mishaps, of course, in the culinary department. A few chops were burned, and the baked potatoes resembled lumps of coal rather than things edible. But there was plenty for all, and nothing had ever tasted so good as the supper eaten there on the floor before the dancing flames. Afterward, when things were cleared away, and the boys sprawled out on their blankets before the fireplace, the 2 lanterns were extinguished, and only the red glow of the fire illumined the half circle of eager young faces. The wailing of the wind in the pines and the soft, whispering beat of snow against the windows served only to intensify the cozy warmth and cheer of the cabin. Instinctively the boys drew closer together, and, snuggling in their blankets, discussed for a space the unbelievable stupidity of any sane person preferring a humdrum evening at home to this. Then someone besought Mr. Curtis to tell a story. "What kind of story?" asked the scoutmaster, smiling. "Oh, a ghost story, of course," urged several voices at once. Mr. Curtis laughed, stretched out his legs comfortably, thought for a moment or 2, and then in a slow, sepulchral voice began a narrative which he called "The Headless Horseman of the Harlem." It was a tale full of creeps and thrills, abounding in dank vaults, weird apparitions, wild storms, midnight encounters, and various other appropriate settings and incidents. The boys drew closer still, luxuriating in the spookiness of it all. And then, just as some of the more impressionable were beginning to cast nervous glances behind them, he ended with a ridiculous climax that brought forth a shout of laughter and turned the whole thing into a farce. A round robin followed, the scoutmaster starting a yarn and leaving it at an exciting and dramatic moment for the boy on his right to continue. The absurdity of these continuations kept the crowd in a constant gale of merriment, and when the round was made they clamored for another. But it was growing late, so Mr. Curtis substituted a brief anecdote of scout bravery which had a humorous twist. It was the story, so often repeated in scout annals, of a little fellow plunging unhesitatingly to the rescue of a bigger boy who had stumbled beyond his depth in the swimming hole. The stronger lad seized his rescuer about the neck and forced his head below the water. The youngster was unable to free himself, but with head down and breath almost gone, he hit bottom. And then, calmly walking along it, he tugged along his struggling friend until the bank was reached. He simply kept his head, you see, and used his brain, which is one of the best things scouting teaches us, concluded Mr. Curtis. He stood up, stretching. "Blankets out, fellows," he went on, "and everybody in bed." Each bunk had been planned to accommodate 2 occupants, so there was no crowding or necessity for makeshifts. The fire was piled up with fresh logs, and though there was a good deal of preliminary laughter and chattering, the boys were too tired to stay awake long, even under the novel conditions. Bob Gibson was one of the last to close his eyes. He had the outside of one of the lower bunks with a full view of the fire, and though few would have suspected his gruff, matter-of-fact manner to overlay even a touch of poetry or imagination, he lay there watching it for a long time, fascinated by the leaping, dancing, crimson-yellow flames, until sleep at last overtook him. How long he lay oblivious to sights and sounds he had no idea, but it must have been hours later when he found himself sitting bolt upright, every nerve tingling, and in his ears the echo of that strange, horrible cry that had shocked him into complete wakefulness. "What's that?" came in a tense, frightened gasp from one of the boys across the room. Bob did not answer. He sat there shaking nervously and straining his ears for a repetition of the ghastly sound. The fire had died down to a bed of dull red embers, and there was a noticeable chill over everything. He caught his breath as a dark shadow swiftly passed him, and then realized with a feeling of keen relief that it was Mr. Curtis. A moment later the scoutmaster had thrown an armful of light wood on the embers, and the fire blazed up, illumining the pale faces of the boys, strained, startled, but all tense with expectation. Suddenly the cry came again, a piercing, strangled, high-pitched scream that turned the blood cold and brought out beads of perspiration on more than one forehead. It seemed to come from just outside the cabin door. End of chapter 12.